Benjmin Mullin joins me live from St. Petersburg, Florida. Ben, what did they tell you? What did journalists tell you about what was missed and how they missed this story?
Hey, Carol. Most journalists I talked to mentioned a failure of many mainstream national news organizations to sort of get outside the so-called Acela corridor of Washington, D.C., Boston, and New York City, and take the pulse of American voters in rural America, the so-called quote-unquote flyover states, many of whom showed overwhelming support for Trump. So I think that was one of the big factors that we saw. Mm-hmm. Another factor I think that we saw is just a failure in predictive polling. And I want to be careful when we sort of, not always, but I think a lot recently we've sort of used the term the media and sort of tarred the brush and said that everyone was surprised by this story. Mm-hmm. I think we should, we shouldn't necessarily say that all journalists missed the story. I just think that in general, there was sort of a failure of predictive polling and perhaps a failure to do enough on-the-ground reporting.
Okay, so three things that you mentioned there that I want to dive into, this rural-urban divide. Let's put that aside for a second, and let's start with your third point, which is about the pollsters. I mean, we've seen this not only here, we've seen it in Brexit, we've seen it here in Canada. We were taken by surprise a number of years ago with what we call the orange wave up here. What is that about? What does that seem to be about? Any indication?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a few things. I think in an election that there was enormous populist support for a figure who railed against the media and who railed against institutions. To me, it's not surprising that the people who were polled may have had a tendency not to either talk to pollsters or to tell pollsters that they weren't supporting President Trump. So I think there may have been a failure on just the information gathering level. Another thing is that there's, I think, what's called a Desirability Index, and this basically tells us that politicians who have more fiery rhetoric, who folks may not want to identify with publicly. Mr. Trump made a number of statements during the campaign that were viewed as controversial. Mm-hmm. There is a sense that maybe these folks were less likely to identify themselves as affiliated with Trump, or maybe less likely to talk to pollsters, period. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say is that, as folks are shifting away from landlines and towards mobile phones, maybe there is a failure among pollsters to recognize the new ways that people register sentiment, online and on social media. And so I think that perhaps we need to come up with some different ways of sampling people.
Yeah. I heard a lot of stories about people who are getting their their information on Donald Trump, on Hillary Clinton, online, fake media sources, Facebook postings, those sorts of things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this was something that was big during the election. I think this truly was the election where you saw candidates in themselves become more than just objects of media scrutiny, but they became in themselves publishers. Donald Trump had a nightly news show that he broadcast from Trump Tower in the run-up to Election Day. And Hillary Clinton also had a website where she posts several things that were sort of made for social media that looked like news stories that weren't actually news stories. She developed a podcast. So I do think that, and especially this stuff, I think was enabled by, Facebook's newsfeed algorithm, which sort of supports our own confirmation bias. It shows us things that we're more likely to share and click on. So I do think that another failure was not only in the news production side during this election, but also the news consumption side.
Do you think the media bias in some cases help the media miss the story? And again, I know you're saying not all media, but generally.
Yeah, I think again that term the media is just I tend to shy away from it because the media is such a multifaceted thing. there were journalists on the ground from the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Those news organizations have all been criticized, but they were news organizations that did in-depth looks at the Trump vote and Trump supporters. That said, you did see in my survey, as well as other subsequent surveys from other news organizations, you did see many news executives realize that maybe they're too caught in their own bubble in Manhattan or Boston or DC. So I do think probably there was some of that, but I would caution against sort of laying the blame for anything at the media's feet.
Okay, Trump certainly lays a lot of blame at the media's feet for their behavior before and after the election. Blaming them for the protests, for example, in one tweet. What do you think will happen to those? We saw Trump gave us his first interview since his election to the Wall Street Journal, one of the few newspapers that did not endorse Clinton. They abstained from making a choice. But what do you think will happen to all those outlets, those journalists who did endorse Clinton?
I think that's a great question, and I think a lot of people probably don't make the distinction between, say, the New York Times editorial page and the New York Times news page. And so I think, Liz Spade, the Republic editor, recently mentioned that there were canceled subscriptions, angry letters. So I do think that news organizations, at least in the eyes of Americans, have some rebuilding of their credibility to do, in large part because their polling was wrong and they were lambasted during the campaign by the Republican candidate who's now president. So I do think there is some sort of a truth and reconciliation that needs to be done. And I think that, you saw just yesterday, the publisher of the New York Times put out a letter telling readers that Trump would be covered fairly. You saw news organizations like the Daily Beast say that they would be part of, quote unquote, the loyal opposition. And then you saw the Huffington Post, which previously had branded Donald Trump racist and a liar below all their posts. They removed that note. So I do think you're seeing the media begin to recalibrate and sort of assess how they should cover Trump going forward.